This is Section 2, Lecture 2. We're still focusing on the history of U.S. foreign policy, but in this lecture we're going to focus on presidential doctrines. Those are the big foreign policy initiatives of different presidents in the latter half of the 20th century and in the beginning of now the 21st century. These are oftentimes referred to as grand strategies. A grand strategy is a statement of a nation state's essential objectives in world politics and the means to achieve these objectives. If we put this into the context of U.S. foreign policy, our essential objectives in foreign policy have helped to define the presidential doctrines or presidential takes on foreign policy from President Truman through President Obama. These are big picture actions and big picture objectives in foreign policy. The problem is achieving these objectives. Just as we will see throughout the course, the problem with U.S. foreign policy is having it work out the way that we want to. Things don't always work out the way that we want to. And despite the best efforts of different presidential administrations, there is always the problem of incomplete knowledge and the lack of control. As we will see in Chapter 3, there are organizational and political barriers which administrations have to overcome. And also, as we will see in Chapter 3, there are psychological and perceptual barriers which have to be overcome and can infringe upon the successful achievement of our foreign policy goals. So after World War II, the world was in a bipolar balance of power. That is, the United States and its allies and the Soviet Union and its allies faced off against one another. And this helped to define the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine basically is the containment of communism. And initially this began with giving money to anti-communist efforts in Greece and Turkey so they became our allies rather than Soviet allies. They also became members of NATO, the alliance, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Later, the Truman Doctrine and the containment of communism expanded to include policies of encircling the Soviet Union, that is, creating alliances not just in Europe, but in Asia and in East Asia in order to prevent them from expanding their power. It also included covert action, support for key allies in the world, and a basic national security policy of deterring the Soviet Union through the balance of power. This is something that we will define in Section 3 when we talk about foreign policy theory and ideologies. So this idea of containment came from a policy paper which was authored by State Department official George Kennan as a middle ground between detachment from the world or detachment from involvement in the politics of the Soviet Union and a full-scale invasion of them. And the objectives were preventing communist expansion. This is why it's called containment. Strengthening our political, economic, and military ties to allies, building alliances like NATO, building organizations, investing in money with a Marshall Plan, so on and so forth. We also saw that involvement in civil wars and struggles around the world to promote anti-communist regimes was also part of the overall containment policy. So, what did we do? In the Truman administration, there was the creation of the National Security Council and the National Security Agency and the Central Intelligence Agency, along with other federal departments, all focused on U.S. national security and all typically focused on the containment of the spread of Soviet power. But as we will see, particularly in the chapter on bureaucracy later in the course, there are problems in and among these agencies, little information sharing. A lot of them are flawed by design. We'll talk about that in the bureaucracy chapter later on. The Truman Doctrine also created and helped to strengthen our relationships with allies around the world. Internationally, the Bretton Woods institutions extended U.S. economic ideologies. The creation of the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, particularly. In 1947, President Truman extended military and economic aid to Greece and Turkey to combat communist aggression there. In 1947, the Marshall Plan developed economic aid for European nation states to help them rebuild. And in 1949, NATO was formed, creating a military alliance between the United States and Western European countries. In the Eisenhower administration, this idea of the containment of the Soviet Union and the containment of communism held over and was built upon. We see this all the way through the Reagan administration. President Eisenhower's take on this was to have a new look at our military buildup. And so, in the ideas of balancing against the power of the Soviet Union and containing then their influence and power, during the Eisenhower administration, we have a massive buildup of nuclear weapons. This also included extending alliances beyond NATO to the Pacific realm as well, containment in our alliances with Japan and South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. That's ANZUS. SEATO is the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization. These are directly tied to containment policies. Another part of the Eisenhower Doctrine is claiming the Middle East as a vital region to the United States. This would be containing Soviet influence south into the Middle East. In the Kennedy administration and the Johnson administrations, these ideas of containment continued. And it didn't really change very much until the Nixon administration. During the Nixon administration, we were heavily involved in Southeast Asia and the Vietnam War. That too was part of the containment strategy. The idea was that we had to aid nation states fighting against communism. In this case, the South Vietnamese fighting against the North Vietnamese, the communists. But one thing changed in the Nixon administration, and this was the idea introduced by National Security Advisor Henry Kissinger, called détente. This is the easing of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union and China, our Cold War foes. The fear was that one of these hot wars, like Vietnam, where the U.S. was fighting against an ally of the Soviet Union, or was being as North Vietnam was being aided by the Soviet Union and China, would spark then a hot war, which would lead to a nuclear war between the Soviet Union and China. This was also part of triangular diplomacy to weaken, in part, the Soviet Union by making our ties with China stronger. And so President Nixon very famously eased our relationship with China. He went to China and visited Mao Zedong. The idea was to set the Soviet Union and China as enemies of one another, thereby taking their focus off of the United States. Another element of the Nixon Doctrine was having nation states whom we supported in war, in fighting against communism, have ownership of this fight. And this is referred to as Vietnamization. The idea in this case is that the Vietnamese should be fighting their own wars with aid and support of the United States, and we shouldn't necessarily fight wars on other nation states' behalves. Well, this was inevitably due to the unpopularity back home of the Vietnam War and our military involvement there. But during this whole time, we see that the containment policy of helping stop the spread of communism and the influence of the Soviet Union is still evident. We're still fighting against communism in Vietnam. We're still balancing against the power of the Soviet Union and the growing power of China, and trying to balance the power of them versus one another, which then would weaken any power they project towards the United States. During the Carter administration, there was a more easing of tensions that went on, or easing of relationship, and President Carter, while continuing containment policies, backed away from them some and called for a liberal internationalist foreign policy. That is, more open engagement with the Soviet Union, agricultural exchanges and trade. President Carter wanted to focus on human rights in the Soviet Union, improving living conditions in developing nation states around the world where the Soviet Union may gain some influence. And so then President Carter wanted to be more engaged in a peaceful way rather than in a war-footing way in the world. And this is related to him brokering a peace agreement called the Camp David Accords between Israel and Egypt. But the world still goes on in a tense way. The Carter administration had a lot of failures. The Iran hostage crisis is seen as the primary one. But there was also a Marxist revolution going on in Central America, which the Reagan administration would get heavily involved in. And the Carter administration, particularly the CIA, gets the blame for this, of totally missing the invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviets. Once again, the Reagan administration would become very heavily involved in that area as well. But what we see in the Carter administration is a focus on peaceful areas, a focus on the Middle East is a vital interest of the United States. This has to do with the oil crises and shocks of the 1970s, protection of Saudi Arabia in the Persian Gulf region, continues containment policies via the balance of power, but wants to work within limitations uh, with the Soviet Union, particularly on the reduction of arms. During the Reagan administration, this was pushed back against, this sort of openness and the idea of working with the Soviet Union. And so the Reagan Doctrine represents a complete shift away from the Carter Doctrine and calls for overpowering the Soviet Union rather than working with them. And what we see then is a massive military and defense and technological buildup in the United States. And this is referred to as power preponderance, a desire to have dominance of power over the Soviet Union rather than the long-standing balance of power towards the Soviet Union that had been the basis of U.S. foreign policy since the Truman administration. If we look at George Herbert Walker Bush's presidency, he doesn't really get the level of having a presidential doctrine. Perhaps this is only because he served one term. But a lot of important things internationally are going on during his time. That is, the end of the Soviet Union, the end of the Cold War. What he focused on was a peaceful end to that transition in that order, and began to focus on what still presidents today are focusing on: democratization around the world, the expansion of political rights, economic globalization, a growth of international markets, and particularly U.S. involvement in international markets around the world, and focused on multilateral cooperation, U.S. involvement through international organizations. In this, the United States looked to expand its economic markets into the rest of the world, particularly those Soviet allied states. And this was continued in the Clinton administration. So if we look at the Clinton doctrine, President Clinton adopted a strategy called engagement and enlargement. Engagement with the rest of the world by the United States in a peaceful way. Enlargement when it comes to enlarging our influence, enlarging our economic status, and enlarging the number of nation states that were democracies. And so during the Clinton administration, the focus began on democratization, or helping those post-Soviet states, particularly those in Eastern Europe, transition into open economic markets and democracies. And so he called for more engagement in the world and the spread of democracy. The reaction to this during the early Bush administration was to focus, in a way, on isolationism. Before September 11th, President Bush's focus seemed to be on rolling back the influence, what they saw as the misguided influence of the Clinton administration, rejecting international protocols like the Kyoto Protocol on environmental concerns, rejecting treaties with other nation states, rejecting our reliance on international organizations, rejecting the idea that the United States should be engaged in nation building. Well, all of that was before September 11th. After September 11th, the foreign policy of the Bush administration changed drastically. And so the Bush doctrine is focused on preventative military engagement, preemptive war. This would be our policy seen in the invasion of Iraq in 2003. A focus on not just terrorism, but the allies of terrorists, the war on terror, placed no distinction between terrorist organizations and nation states that supported them. Our foreign policy stance was not multilateral, working with other nation states alone, but part of the Bush Doctrine was seen to focus on unilateral policies, going it alone if we had to. But also, as part of this, we saw what began during the first President Bush administration, the spread of democracy and the continued spread of democracy holding over these three presidential administrations. And we see this still holding over during the Obama administration. Now, some critics of the current president say that there is no such thing as the Obama Doctrine. Others disagree. What we see is part of a holdover of Bush administration policies. While President Obama wanted to withdraw militarily from Iraq and Afghanistan, we see that he hasn't necessarily been able to, particularly from Afghanistan, and now we have troops back in Iraq engaging with ISIS. And so we still have a holdover policies of the Bush administration with the war on terror, albeit with a smaller military footprint rather than larger ones. But President Obama, like some of his predecessors, intended to focus on our influence in the world through international organizations. Some refer to this as soft power, making our institutions and ideologies attractive to other nation states so that they'll adopt them. And so we see President Obama working in a more multilateral way rather than the unilateral way of the Bush administration. And I have placed this terminology down at the bottom called situational pragmatism. One of the criticisms of the Obama foreign policy is that it doesn't seem to be consistent. Well, that is because some scholars claim that Obama is a pragmatist, practical, and will only act where necessary, when necessary, even if it seems inconsistent across relationships with different countries. As an example, why support very largely efforts to overthrow leadership in Libya and not support very largely overthrowing leadership in Syria? That seems like an inconsistency to a lot of people. But it's seen as then by the Obama administration as a practical decision. Maybe it works in one area and doesn't work in another area. And so then we see this slide. Now this is from chapter 4 of your textbook, not from chapter 2, but it outlines the presidential doctrines, outlining U.S. foreign policy history from the Truman administration to the present. We will continue to talk about these. We will continue to discuss these presidential doctrines and these ideas throughout the course.